Hi, I'm John Bryan, West Virginia civil rights lawyer. You're about to see a video showing some of the last breaths taken by my client James Dean in the presence of his mother after he had been dropped off at the hospital in Huntington, West Virginia, following his arrest by the Coma, West Virginia Police Department.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
James's mother, Olivia, is saying to her son, "Can you hear me? Can you hear me?" Because he's on a breathing machine and he's completely unresponsive, no brain activity whatsoever. After being dropped off at this hospital by a police department in custody, doctors were pressuring her to turn off or authorize turning off the breathing machine. It was only me there and a reporter that I brought with me, and we were not allowed to take any pictures or video to document what was happening. So we secretly, or I secretly, took this picture and this footage of what was going on in front of me. It was unbelievable. This happened in the small town of Coma, which is in Wayne County, West Virginia. And here's what happened. On April 5th of 2019, James Dean was at his residence, which was also the residence of his mother, Olivia Dean. He was residing there. His mother had called 911 for a second time that day because the two had been arguing. James had a long-term alcohol problem, and he had been drinking more as time went on. He got loud with her. His actions caused Olivia to fear for her safety, so she did call 911, and she went to her neighbor's residence, locked the door, and waited for the police to arrive. Shortly after the 911 call, the Coma Police Department arrived, as well as the town of Cerrito Police Department. They help each other. They responded on the scene, and the officers took James into custody with no problem at that time, and they removed him from the residence. Olivia then observed that her son was handcuffed with his hands behind his back while being led by the police officer. He appeared to her to be compliant and calm at that time, and this was the last time that she would ever see her son. This was approximately 11 p.m. on the night of April 5th, 2019. The next day, around 3 or 4 p.m., Olivia received a phone call from a man identifying himself as a surgeon from Cabell Huntington Hospital in Huntington, West Virginia. He told Miss Dean that he had just performed a craniotomy on her son and that it wasn't looking good, and her son was in a coma and she needed to come to the hospital right away. What Olivia didn't know is that after her son was taken away from the residence, handcuffed by the police, that there was a violent encounter between her son and a Coma police officer, the one who was escorting her son. And that resulted in her son being transported to this hospital by ambulance only minutes after she had last seen him walking away. Olivia had not been notified by any police department official or town official. She was only notified by the surgeon the next afternoon, after it was too late. The police officer removed James Dean from the police cruiser and began to walk him inside. Shortly after exiting the police cruiser, with his hands still handcuffed behind his back, the officer ended up engaging in a use of violent physical force against James Dean. That's what we believe happened, resulting in severe head trauma. There was a witness who had also been arrested by the Coma Police Department that night, and he had overheard the officer who arrested him complaining that his guys got to fight with a drunk who was also now being transported to the hospital. And he was sort of upset, according to the witness, that he missed out on the fight. Now, the witness was at the hospital at the time the conversation took place because he himself had been arrested by the Coma police and also had to be admitted to the hospital for his injuries. When I got the 911 transcripts, you can hear the dispatcher say, "We got another one to send to the hospital."
911.
Hey,
Hey.
I got another one you got to start EMS down here for.
What's going on with this one?
Well, I'm not sure, but I think he fell out front here as they were bringing him in. He's pretty intoxicated, though, so
Okay.
let me get some details, and I'm going to lay the phone down, okay?
Okay, that's fine.
All right.
That was the Canova Police Department talking to the 911 dispatcher saying, we have another person who'd been arrested by our police department who now needs to be transported to the hospital. Well, there were no police around anywhere. There was no documentation. There was nothing in writing in black and white at all saying that this guy had anything to do with the police. There was no record of him being in police custody. There was nothing on file at any courthouse. I was unable to find anything. All of a sudden, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I said, oh my God, this could be a cover-up. But when I found the 911 materials, that documented that he was actually brought to the hospital by the Canova Police Department. I ended up calling the chief of police there, and I asked him what happened, and he told me that there was a use of force incident, that the officer who was leading him did have him handcuffed behind his back. My client had said something to the effect of, I don't want to go back to jail, or I'm not going back to jail, and maybe pulled away. At that point, he was taken to the ground by the police officer. So I knew after that point that this wasn't somebody who just fell accidentally. It was actually a use of force. And as soon as things went south at the hospital, boom, police are out of the picture. Nothing in writing, no record of it. And you just have this lawyer asking questions. This wasn't my first time dealing with a case like this. I actually had a very similar case out of Logan County, West Virginia, where another arrestee was handcuffed, hands behind his back. We disagreed about the facts and almost had a jury trial over it, but whatever happened, he takes a header into the concrete below and ended up like James Dean in a coma. Though fortunately, this client was only in a coma for about 18 days, if I recall correctly. I was also able to eventually verify through the medical records that he was brought in by the police and did suffer trauma to his head as a result of his interaction with the police. And that trauma to his head caused a brain bleed, which then necessitated a craniotomy to take place, though it didn't turn out well. Then, believe it or not, we had to wait a year for the West Virginia Medical Examiner's Office to give us a death certificate. You can see that the date of death was April 22nd, 2019. Then the cause of death was released in the death certificate on July 13th, 2020. They did find that the cause was blunt force trauma to the head. Eventually, my client did pass away, and when he did, the TV news wanted to do a segment on it, and they came and interviewed me at my office, and they did their own investigation into the case, and that actually helped produce the 911 recording that you already heard and some other associated written documents that were provided.
Yeah, what started out as a pretty simple domestic disturbance call ended with James Dean in a coma on a respirator. He died this morning, leaving more questions as to exactly what happened to him while he was in the custody of Canova police. Dean died early this morning.
You have to protect everybody's constitutional rights, or none of us have any constitutional rights.
Brian was contacted by Dean's family to look into the case. He says he was told by Canova Police Chief Bob Sullivan that there was an incident when officers were trying to get Dean into the Canova Police Department for processing.
They're alleging that there was some resistance from James, that maybe he said that he didn't want to go to jail or didn't want to go in there. And at that point, the officer shoved James, was what I was told, and they both went to the ground, both the officer and James, and they both hit their head.
Wayne County Prosecutor Thomas Plymel says he's asked the West Virginia State Police to investigate Dean's death. Brian says there are no written reports about Dean's arrest and what happened in the police department parking lot. He also can't find any 911 calls surrounding Dean's health emergency and journey to Cabo Huntington. Brian says he's hopeful the state police can find out what happened.
There's no paperwork, there's no documentation, no communication. So that right there, it's not proof of anything, but it's a big, big, big red flag. That brings us to where we are, and hopefully now you understand why this process can take too long. Now there's getting ready to be additional news in this case. Stay tuned, and we'll do an update video soon.